Hi, everyone. I'm Shauna Weatherly. I'm a business management specialist with the GSA Center for Charge Card Management, and this class is GSA SmartPay Advanced Purchase Management. This class is geared for experienced AOPCs who are looking for more in-depth information about how to work within the gray areas of your program. My primary role in CCCM is being the contracting officer's representative for the SmartPay 3 master contracts. But my life before coming to CCCM 6 years ago was that of a contracting officer, and I did that for over 25 years. The positions I've held in the contracting field include Chief of Services and Supplies branch, a Chief of Contracting, both of those with the Army Corps of Engineers, a Chief of a Facilities and National Aerospace Contract Award branch with the FAA, and I've also been an acquisition workforce training and development coordinator for travel, transportation, and logistics at GSA. So I'm kind of tapped here to be the GSA SmartPay customer subject matter expert when it comes to purchase card questions, because I have a lot of experience in that area, and I do a lot of review of purchase card policies and have done several business line audits in the past. So I'm trying to bring that experience to this class, and this is a class that we've had a lot of requests for and interest on developing, and hopefully some of the 33 years I've been doing this will help you walk away with some knowledge today as we field this new training. So I'm really excited about it, and I hope you are too. So this course picks up where the Purchase Essentials class leaves off, and it's a deeper dive into the subjects that AOPCs deal with on a daily basis. Like I said, we've had a lot of interest in this class, and it takes a more detailed look about how you can classify purchases and apply the appropriate micro-purchase threshold depending on the situation. Now, before we get started, I just want to say that everything I'm going to say today and even more, including FAR references and statutes and all sorts of things, are included in the course materials that will be available for download. And also note that nothing I say here today overrules your agency or local policies for the use and management of the purchase card. We're going to speak strictly from the viewpoint of what the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or the FAR, and the OMB Circular A-123 Appendix D dictate, with some Code of Federal Regulations and labor law information thrown in, as well as some best practices. So here's a quick rundown of the learning objectives we're going to cover in our session today, and by the time we're done, you're going to be able to do all these things. One thing I'm going to let you know up front also is we're not going to get into the areas of innovative uses or talk about specific tools that are available to use as part of looking at your data in this presentation. The GSA SmartPay group offers classes here at the forum that cover those subject areas in a lot of detail, much more than we could ever get into today. So I'm recommending that you take those courses in conjunction with your program-specific courses if you want to learn more about innovative solutions and how to use your data tools. So let's just kind of start out with the basics again, the definitions and thresholds of our micro-purchase purchases that we can make. You'll notice if you go to the FAR subpart 2.101 that's referenced here, that it still says that the micro-purchase threshold is $3,500, but that's all going to be updated and changed as of August 31st. That's going to now reflect the $10,000 micro-purchase threshold that has been in effect since FY 18 and 19. And we're going to walk through the basic definitions, micro-purchase thresholds, and exceptions in the GSA SmartPay class, but not in much more depth, not at the same level. We're going to get into some of the gray areas about how you can apply those definitions and thresholds when it comes to your real-life buying using the cards. And because we get into some trickier territory as the micro-purchase threshold increases, this course is going to go into depth on these topics to help you better be able to define what you're buying and the correct thresholds to apply. When we're talking about everything today, we're going to focus on the use of the card as a procurement mechanism as we talk, and talk about categorizing purchases as either construction, service, or supply. Now, when you're using the purchase card as an ordering mechanism, both over and under the micro-purchase threshold, you're only using existing contracts. And those contracts have already been determined to be either a service, a supply, or construction. And if the order is for construction, you've already got limits on what you can place up to the $2,000 mark, and the same is true of services when it comes to using your card. The only way you can order over that is if you're a contracting officer who's warranted and also holds a card. So keep those things in mind as we go through. We're going to talk strictly from like open market purchasing here, procuring. Judgment when it comes to whether an order falls under construction or service really isn't necessary. So like I said, they're already existing. And when you're using the purchase card as a payment mechanism, which is that third mechanism, transactions are not classified. They're just limited to the single purchase limit that you have on your card. That's the only thing that comes into play. So with this in mind, let's start walking through some questions that you can ask yourself when you're making a decision how to classify a purchase as either construction, services, or supplies. So what we can do is we can start asking ourselves, what's the primary purpose of the buy or the intent? What do you hope to accomplish? Is it to build a boat dock? Is it to install cabling for better internet service? Is it to buy a trailer to haul equipment? If the work involves a combination of construction, services, and supplies, which is most important? Can the work be separated, or is it so merged or fragmented in its distinction that it cannot be that you cannot make a distinction? So what is the mix of the work compared to the total price? That's another question. So these are all things you have to think about when you're trying to figure out how to classify a purchase. And judgment must be used when you're answering these questions. There's no hard, fast rule to the precise meaning of what a primary purpose is. While prices should be considered in the primary purpose, it's rarely the defining factor. Don't merely equate percentages in terms of the total value and say, well, I have a project where 70% of the cost is supplies and materials and the rest is a service, so I have a supply buy. It's really not that simple. So we're going to walk through the questions that you can ask in order that kind of gives you some tests that you have to help you answer this. So when the micro purchase, when asked which micro purchase threshold applies when you're using the purchase card, sometimes there's a lot of gray area, like I mentioned. So we're not always buying things that on the surface clearly fall into a category, particularly as the micro purchase threshold increase, or when you're buying at a higher micro purchase threshold in the case of contingency buying. And we field a lot of questions throughout the year. I do about how to classify different purchases when it comes to the application of the appropriate micro purchase threshold. So the bulk of this class is going to walk through these series of questions that are yes or no type questions that you can use rather quickly to determine how to employ the micro purchase thresholds and the exceptions to those for service and construction. Keep in mind the primary purpose and the intent of the work as you ask the questions. And so we're going to start with the first and easiest question, which is when you're looking at the primary purpose, is the primary purpose of the work to provide an end item of supply, including installation of the same? If the answer is yes, the purchase card can be used at or below the micro purchase threshold, which is currently $10,000. So that's the easiest answer of all to have, is a yes, that it's a supply. However, if you answer no, then we have to start looking at, does the buy fall under the classification of construction or services? Before we move on, there's some uncertainty about what constitutes a supply at times, so I've listed the characteristics of a supply here. If it's a tangible item that can be overhauled, depreciated, repaired, thrown away, or disposed of, et cetera, as you see on this screen, then it's a supply. A supply is a noun, it's a thing. And also, when we're talking about supplies, the FAR definition of supplies says that it means all property except land or interest in land, and the alteration or installation of the foregoing, meaning it could include altering a supply or installing a supply. Now, when it comes to buying end items of supply, like a piece of large or heavy equipment, there can be incidental services that can exist and associated with the receipt of that item. For example, generators or heavy-duty batteries may need to be installed, and many times vendors will include the installation as part of the total price of the item. They may also include other things like setup, testing, or an hour with your staff to teach you how to run or operate a piece of equipment. If the services are specific to the installation of the supply item, the purchase card can be used up to the micro purchase threshold for supplies. If the services are part of the vendor's normal pricing of the supply item and the type offered to the general public, this is also acceptable, and the service portion of the work does not need to be separately priced. You don't need to ask the contractor to separate out the price of services if all-inclusive pricing is how the vendor normally does their business. However, if the vendor prices incidental services separately, then there are a few things you have to consider. Are the services based on a published catalog or price list available for view? If it's not, can the prices of the services be substantiated through some independent source like comparable pricing of other vendors or the government's knowledge of what maybe it should cost? Are the services of the type offered to the general public as part of this vendor's normal course of business? If services, however, shouldn't be the primary purpose and intent of the work. So when you're determining a supply purchase, it's probably the most simple decision to make between the categories. But again, it can be something that may not be as simple as you think. And we've got a case study here we're going to look at in a bit that could prove that simple is not always so simple. So as we discussed in the Purchase Essentials class, construction means construction, alteration, or repair of real property. It includes improvements of all types. Now, real property is defined as land together with the improvements and structures and fixtures that are located thereon. And that includes prefabricated movable structures under the control of a federal agency. FAR does make a distinction that work on a building or at a work site generally indicates construction activity, and that's different from manufacturing or furnishing of materials or other maintenance work. Construction does not include building, manufacturing, producing, constructing, altering, repairing aircraft or vessels. So if you get into that situation, that is not considered construction. And we know that the micro-purchase threshold is set at $2,000 due to the need to enforce certain wage and fringe benefits as part of the wage rate requirements for construction as originally mandated by the Davis-Bacon Act. So for the purposes of applying wage rate determinations for construction, which is what sets our $2,000 cap, construction, alteration, and repair means all types of work done by laborers and mechanics whose duties are manual or physical in nature. They can be employed by a construction contractor or his subcontractors as part of building or work at a site. It also includes dismantling and demolition and removal of improvements when construction on the same site is anticipated under another contract. And it also includes painting and remodeling and decorating when that's performed in connection with original construction or part of alteration or repair of an existing structure. So you can see that there's a lot of things here that fall under construction. If you can say yes to any of these questions when it comes to the primary purpose or intent of the work, it is construction. And if the work is solely construction, not part of service or a supply buy, you can stop right here and apply the micro-purchase threshold for construction, which is the $2,000 threshold. If there are services or supplies that are commingled with construction, then we have some other considerations. Non-construction buys, such as services and supplies, can involve some construction work. And even when construction is commingled with other requirements, it can be determined separate from the other known services. We still have to be mindful of the wage rates in construction when it can be severable. You have to ask yourself things like, is the work performed as part of a non-construction effort? Is the work performed on a public building or public work? And is it physically or functionally separate from or capable of being performed on a segregated basis from the other work that you may have, the other service or supply? If all those things are yes, and it's all of them, it can't be one or just two, it has to be all three of those questions. If the answer is yes, then the purchase card should only be used if the construction portion of the work is less than the micro-purchase threshold, which is $2,000. Over $2,000, the purchase has to go to a warranted contracting officer because those wage rate requirements for construction kick in, as well as other terms and conditions for construction over that amount. When we have a case where we're buying services or large equipment as a supply, now there may be instances where construction services are also required and they're incidental. So to be considered incidental, it has to be limited to simple installation or alteration at a public building or public work that is required as part of furnishing the supplies or equipment or services that you're trying to buy. So for example, if you're laying a gravel pad to set a generator or an AC unit on when it's delivered. You're not pouring a concrete pad or building a big platform, for instance, but you just have somebody who's clearing the ground a little bit, throwing some gravel down so you have a place to set it. That could be considered incidental. Or the incidental construction could be so merged with non-construction work that you can't even segregate it, and it can be considered incidental in that case. If those are the cases that you have incidental construction, then wage rate requirements for construction do not apply, and the micro purchase threshold for construction does not come into play when you're making your purchase. It can be used over the micro purchase threshold for construction and up to the micro purchase threshold for supplies or services, whichever is the preponderance of the work that you're doing. So it could be $2,500 for services, or it could be up to $10,000 for supplies. When you're talking about incidental construction, it's not just based also on the total value of the work. It's the type and quantity of work to be performed, not the value of it. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about whether or not you have something that's substantial or incidental. When you have to commingle work between construction and any other type of item that you're buying or services, it's always wise to consult a contracting officer or even your legal counsel for assistance. And incidental construction is one of those really gray areas that I mentioned that we all kind of work within once in a while. But, you know, ask questions when you find yourself in a gray area, using the FAR and agency policies and procedures and getting advice from acquisition experts to document your decision. It may take a little bit of effort up front, but it's really important to have that in your pocket as part of the process, especially when you get to audit time and somebody may want to know why you made the purchase with the threshold that you did. So now let's move on to services. In the Purchase Essentials course, we talk about services are defined as directly engaging the time and effort of a contractor whose primary purpose is to perform a task rather than furnish an end item of supply. And we've talked about dismantling and demo and a removal of improvements under construction. But you'll see here that when there is no follow-on construction work at the same site, dismantling, demo, and removal now become a service. So it's construction if there is follow-on work under a different contract. It's services if there's not follow-on construction at the same site. So the differences there are subtle but important. Services include maintenance of real property. Those are things like janitorial services, elevator maintenance, not modernization. That's an improvement. Routine installation support services, transportation of freight and personnel, communications, things like that. However, we touched on in the discussion of construction that things like painting could be a little bit different. It can fall in a couple areas. So like painting is one of those things that it's determined by the total square feet being done, not the dollar value. So if you're painting less than 200 square feet, that's not part of a construction project. It's standing alone. Say you're having somebody come in and paint a room. It's considered services and subject to the 2,500 or lower micro purchase threshold for services, rather than if it's over 200 square feet, regardless of the price or the hours, it becomes construction. Services are also classified as either non-personal or personal, and they can be performed in either professional or by either professional or non-professional personnel, both individually or on an organizational basis. And I think we talk about that a little bit in the Purchase Essentials class. Services also have their own set of characteristics that make them that way. It's a discrete task or hours or a specific effort. They're not off the shelf. They can be solutions, ideas, or specific efforts. Services may not have a tangible end item of delivery. They can also be performed on an end item of supply that the government already owns, such as a repair. Services are not ordered by a part number. They're not able to be duplicated identically. And services can be documents, reports, presentations, advice, technical guidance, counsel, all of those things. All those are characteristics of a service. There are services that are non-personal and personal, and we're going to talk about the differences between the two of them and what they mean to you. Non-personal services are where personnel rendering the services are not subject either by the terms or the manner in the administration of the work to the supervision or control of the government. The work is performed independently, and that means all the oversight for the work, the quality control, et cetera. Personal services are characterized by an employer-employee relationship between the government and contractor personnel that's created either through the terms and requirements of the work or the way you administer the work. Let's say somebody's sitting in the office and you're handing them work to do and you're reviewing the quality of it and you oversee that person on a day-to-day basis. The government is normally required to obtain its employees by direct hire and competitive appointment through civil service laws. And so because of that, agencies are not allowed to award personal service contracts unless they have a specific authority by statute, and you can see that listed at the bottom of the screen. Descriptive elements that should be used as a guide when you're assessing whether or not a service is personal in nature. I have all these listed in the notes, so you don't have to worry about taking them down now, and I'm just going to touch on a few. Are things like if the work is performed on site, if the principal tools and equipment are furnished by the government, if comparable services that meet comparable needs are performed in the same or similar agency using civil service personnel. Are the services going to be expected to last more than a year? Is the inherent nature of the service and the way it is provided or the way it needs to be supervised needed to protect the government's interest or retain control of a certain function? If you have a statutory authority to make a purchase of personal services, it's recommended that you get a review by a legal counsel and obtain that before you do the purchase, just to make sure it's all above board. And if you do make if you are authorized to purchase personal services, they're limited to a certain time frame that's temporary, not to exceed a year. And you have to submit an annual report to the Office of Personnel Management with the number of days the contractor was employed and the full amount that they were paid. Now, there is an exception for temporary help, and FAR allows that under FAR Part 37112. Government can purchase temp services as long as they're intermittent and they're not regarded or treated as personal services. So there is an exception there. And the purchase of personal services is something to really watch out for, especially if you're buying just the help of somebody coming in to do something very quickly. There are statutory exemptions from the Service Contract Labor Standards that's formerly known as the Service Contract Act of 1965, and that's what dictates the lower micro-purchase threshold for services. And that's only applicable, micro-purchase threshold of $2,500 is only applicable if the services are going to be performed in the United States. So there are some exceptions, and they're listed in FAR. I'm going to touch on them real quick. Some exceptions to the Service Contract Labor Standards are transport of freight or personnel, services subject to the Communications Act, public utility services, hotel and motel services for conferences. Okay, you see it just says hotel motel services up there, but it does say in FAR that that's specific to conferences. And it includes lodging and meals as part of a conference agreement. It is not just for standalone lodging or motel services. If somebody doesn't have their travel card and you need to rent a room for them overnight. Financial services are exempt, employment contracts are exempt, real estate services, and all the other ones you see here. When it comes to maintenance and calibration of repair of certain equipment, the FAR lists the type of equipment that are exempt, and those are office and word processing systems, scientific equipment, and medical apparatus, and office and business machines, things like copy machines, where services are performed by the manufacturer or supplier. And then any service performed outside the United States is not subject to the Service Contract Labor Standards. If it's exempt, you can go up to the $10,000 micro-purchase threshold. I talked about there's things such as professional and non-professional services. We mostly talk about non-professional services in the Purchase Essentials class, but we'll get into professional services here in a little bit of detail. When you're talking about professional services, the micro-purchase threshold does not apply if you can determine that professional services are classified in that nature. So professional services are classified because of the way the work, the nature of the work, and that the primary duty is the performance of work requiring knowledge of an advanced type, such as in a field of science or learning that's customarily acquired by a prolonged course of study. This is architects, engineers, scientists, chemists, biologists, accountants, lawyers, doctors, physicists. It can be computer analysts, computer programmers, software engineers, etc. They're all classified as professional services. For the purposes of determining exemption as a professional service, the profession must also be considered exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And exemption means that under the Fair Labor Standards Act means that the employee doing the work is not subject to a minimum wage or overtime requirements and is employed in a bona fide executive, administrative, or professional capacity. Job titles alone are insufficient to establish the exemption status. The exemption status is determined based on whether the salary and the duties of the person doing the work meet the requirements of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And I have the reference to that in the notes, so you can look that up if you're curious. There are some exceptions in this case, however, if people are non-management maintenance employees such as carpenters, electricians, plumbers, iron workers, craftsmen, et cetera, longshoremen, and other types of laborers, they're exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act no matter how highly they might be paid. So if you're buying any services like that, you can be aware of that. Also, so what does it mean when you're doing this? Well, if the work is performed solely by personnel who fall within the bounds of professional services, then you can exceed the micro-purchase threshold of $2,500 for services and go up to the $10,000 threshold. Again, when you're trying to make this determination, I suggest you seek the advice of an acquisition expert like your contracting officer or legal counsel, but this gives you enough information to get started and know where to go. So here's a list of what are considered learned professionals who perform work that may require some advanced knowledge in a field or science, field of science or learning, and knowledge must be customarily acquired by a prolonged course of study. The Fair Labor Standards Act says whether or not they are considered exempt, though, however. And so to qualify for the exemption, the employee's primary duty must be the performance of the exempt work. They can't do 70% non-exempt work and 30% exempt and then be considered fully exempt. The term primary duty means that their work is exempt work that is the principal, main, major, or most important part of what they do. And the test is whether an employee spends more than 50% of their time performing exempt work. You see here if the work is performed by certain categories, whether or not they are considered professional or not professional. So like an accounting clerk or bookkeeper is considered not professional because they usually do not require a 4-year advanced degree. A paralegal or legal assistant, however, is typically considered not professional. However, there could be an instance where they possess an advanced specialized degree, and that advanced knowledge needs to be applied in their field to perform their duties. And if that's the case, they could be considered professional. Computer analysts and hardware software engineers are considered professional. Interpreters may or may not be considered professional. It depends on if they need an advanced degree that is necessary for the type of interpretation they're going to be doing, such as a linguist or something like that. There's stenographers are not considered professional categories because an advanced degree is not required. But when it comes to consultants or advisors, and a lot of people like to call themselves consultants or advisors, you have to go back to the definition of professional services, and it really does depend on the work. So calling oneself a consultant or an advisor just does not confer advanced knowledge necessarily to make that position exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act. So again, going back to what does this all mean to you, if a category is considered professional, you can go up to the micro-purchase threshold of $10,000. If it's considered not professional and that's the type of service you're buying, you're stuck at the $2,500 level. So what happens if you have a mix of professional and non-professional services? This happens a lot of the time. So it comes down to how much of the non-professional work in terms of dollars, not percentages, is being performed. If the non-professional services do not exceed $2,500, you can purchase the services up to the full micro-purchase threshold of $10,000. If the non-professional services do exceed the $2,500, regardless of the aggregate value of the rest of the professional services, the lower micro-purchase threshold of $2,500 applies to the entire buy. So here's a couple examples here. If you're placing an order up to the micro-purchase threshold against an existing contract, like a GSA schedule contract, the job categories and titles and general description of the duties are already included, And typically that information is the responsibility of the requester at the agency to look at and determine whether or not that order would fall under the micro-purchase threshold or not. So you don't get away with it just because you're ordering under an existing contract that you can exceed it. This would apply both for orders and open market procurement mechanism type uses of the card. So you can see here the portion of the work that is non-professional services and does not exceed $2,500. We have a web technician who is considered non-professional at $2,000. The total of the work is $8,000. They can go up to the $8,000 because the web tech stays under $2,500. But in the second example, we have a web tech and an admin clerk, and their total is $3,000. The total of the work in this case is $9,000, but because the web tech and admin clerk are over the $2,500 and they're subject to the service contract labor standards, the limit of $2,500 applies to the entire buy. So hopefully that is clear. Those examples help. So now what we're going to do, now that we've had a roadmap of some questions you can ask, we're going to apply them to a couple of case studies and see how that goes. So our first case study is, and these are all real world examples, by the way. This cardholder received a request to purchase batteries and cables along with a transmitter, extender, and a receiver capable of extending multi-channel audio signals up to 70 meters. And you see the total price was $9,983. Now, the cardholder was new to the office, and his supervisor asked him to make the supply buy using his purchase card and his recently increased single purchase limit to $10,000. And the cardholder saw labor as an itemized cost on the effort and had some concerns. He provided the AOPC with a copy of the vendor's quote for the work and asked for some help deciding if the buy was subject to the micro-purchase threshold for supplies or the lower threshold for services. So where would you begin to walk through this and make that determination? So first, let's look at the quote so we understand the work that's being requested. As you can see here, the quote's itemized and it contains two line items for labor. One is an application systems analyst / programmer and a communications installer. The labor comprises $7,759.83 of the total, or 78%. The supplies and miscellaneous materials comprise the remaining 22%, or right around a little over $2,000. So when talking to the requester, he insisted the services were incidental to the purchase of the battery and cable and other supplies, although a majority of the price and the work and the hours being done fall within these application system analyst, programmer, and communications installer. So let's ask ourselves some of the series of questions we went through earlier to determine what we really have going on with this quote. So let's do the test for supply first. Is the primary purpose to provide an end item supply, including installation of the same? And what is it that we hope to accomplish here? What is the most important thing in this case? Is it the purchase of the batteries and cable and transmitter and extender, or is it the installation to get those in so that they're actually work? Are the supplies of any value without the installation of the services? If we bought all those supplies, would they do us any good if they weren't installed? In this case, the work can be separated clearly between services and supplies, and it's not so merged or fragmented that there's a distinction that can't be made. So could the services be considered incidental to the supply purchase? While the amount of the services alone, that $7,700 and some dollars, it doesn't dictate the purchase. In this case, the labor is separately priced, and it's the type generally offered to the public. And the whole point of this is getting a better signal relay. And so without that installation of the supplies, you know, we would not have a working end result. So the test for supply is not met here. So now we go on to the test for services. So does this work include constructing, altering, repairing, or improving any real property? No. Can you answer any of those questions we had on the earlier slide for tests for construction? The answer to all those questions are no. And as a result, we know we don't have construction and we don't have supplies with incidental construction. So that means our next decisions are all around services and what type and if there's an exemption. So our questions for services was, is it a service? Does it engage the time, effort of a contractor to perform a work or a task? Yes. Is it non-personal or personal? Well, if the work is independently performed by contractor personnel, it's non-personal, so that's a yes. Does the work fall under a statutory exemption? In this case, it does not fall under one of the exemptions that we talked about. And is the work considered a professional service? Well, we have one labor category that's an analyst/programmer. However, we have another category that's an installer that's 48% of the price, which is not considered professional and is covered by the service contract labor standards. So professional services are not a preponderance of the work, and therefore, based on the information we have a service that's installation that includes labor subject to the service contract labor standards that exceeds that $2,500. So what is the solution? The cardholder could not make this purchase using the purchase card because it exceeds the $2,500 limit for services, and it should be forwarded to an acquisition or procurement official who could further process the request. So there's our first case study. Let's look at a couple more. Here's one we call Shut the Front Door. A government facility needed to replace a door, and the requester had the cardholder purchase a large metal and glass double door for $5,750 last week. Once the door was delivered, the requester planned to have the base's operation and maintenance contractor remove the old door and replace it with a new door. But the O&M contractor notified their COR they would be adding this task to their weekly orders and was told it did not fall within the scope of their contract. So now the requester has brought the cardholder an email saying that they're willing to do the work on a separate basis outside of their contract if the government wants to use the purchase card. And they quoted a flat price of $2,125 for the installation. The cardholder called the AOPC and is concerned they didn't know how to make the purchase because the price exceeded the micro purchase threshold for construction. So where do you begin? Well, what we have is we have an email from the contractor stating that they will do the work separately, and they give us a price to use the card. So that's really great. So let's look again through the test. The test is for supply. Well, we know we don't have a supply buy because we already bought the door. That was purchased under a separate transaction. So we can skip all those questions and go straight to construction. Now, running down that list of questions again for construction, can we answer any of those? Yes. We're only concerned about removing an existing door and installing a new door we already own in its place. While a new door may seem like an improvement, FAR 2.101 defines an improvement as things like adding sewer mains and power lines and streets and docks and, walls and other large items into a building. It's a new door in this case is not considered an improvement. And it's not an improvement for our purposes of the test. So that leaves us with services. So by process of elimination, the work is a service because it engages the time and effort of a contractor whose primary purpose is to perform a task, install a door. So it's non-personal or personal? It's non-personal, obviously. They're not going to be supervised by us. Does the work fall under a statutory exemption, from the service contract labor standards? No. Is the work considered professional services? No, it's not considered a professional service. So based on the information we have a service that is, and not a construction buy, which the cardholder was concerned about. The cardholder can make the purchase using the purchase card because it doesn't exceed the $2,500 limit. Now, this example shouldn't be interpreted that doors being replaced all the time fall under services. If doors range from office doors to aircraft hangar doors, but if your requirement is more along the lines of an aircraft hangar door and the quote is for installation over $2,500, you might want to take a closer look at it and see if it does fall within construction or not. It's going to depend on what the circumstances are around the replacement of that door. Now we have another case study. This one is pretty relevant, consider the pandemic response. We have an email that you can read here from Judy. Judy's talking about finishing a COVID-related project done under the higher micro purchase threshold of $20,000 for contingency operations. They got an email with a price from a vendor, but only realized that her charge card has a limit of $10,000 for a single purchase limit, and the buy is for $17,000. How should I go forward with this? And they're asking for your help. So after reaching out, the cardholder explained that the work is to design an interagency knowledge base for authoritative information on COVID-19. She's never used a purchase card over $2,500 before, and she was really confused by all the definitions of services that she found. And so we decided to break down the decision for her so she understood. So using the test for supply, we know we don't have a supply here because we're getting a service. We know we don't have construction because we're not talking about altering or repairing anything. So we go to services and we ask, is this non-personal or personal? Well, the work is performed independently, so it's non-personal. Does the work fall under a statutory exemption? The work is not one of the items listed as a statutory exemption, so we move to the next test, which is the work considered professional services or not? Now, the key word here is design, which indicates that work must be completed by a person with knowledge of an advanced type in a field of science or learning customarily acquired through that prolonged course of study we talked about. And the requester indicates that the work will be solely performed by computer analysts and other computer personnel with advanced knowledge and applications of system analysis techniques and things like that. The ability to determine hardware and software and system functionality. So the work meets the test of a professional service. However, it's highly recommended, again, if you have this, that you also obtain a copy of the statement of work or other specifications so you can be assured as you look at the work that it falls within the type of work that is considered also a professional work. It's not that their title is one, but the work they're doing is non-professional. So based on the information that we have, we can determine this as a professional service, which means it's not subject to the Service Contract Act or the lower cap of $2,500. And so the cardholder can make the purchase using the purchase card after their single purchase limit is raised, or another cardholder with an appropriate limit can make the buy instead. So that's how we would solve this case study. Now, our last one is very quick. It's land use and permits. And Fort Sill Army Base has a use of state parcels of land to conduct training, and it requires the purchase of land permits every 5 years. And the cardholder's been tasked to buy the permits, but doesn't know how they've been purchased in the past, and knows they cost $4,000 total and they're good for 5 years. So the cardholder is looking for some help on how to classify this. So our test for this is a test for supply. Well, it's not a supply because we're not buying an item that meets the characteristic of supply. It's not construction because we're not doing anything that involves alteration, repair of real property. And services, well, the work doesn't meet the true characteristics of a service. The purchase doesn't engage the time or effort of a contractor to perform a task. So what do you do when the purchase doesn't fit easily into any category? Well, the FAR definitions of service and supply don't always provide this clarity. So the purpose of the permit may provide some clarity. Are we buying it the right to use the land or legal access from the land from an intangible service perspective? In this case, the solution is acknowledging that the principal purpose of the requirement is not for the agency to receive services through the use of service employees, and it's not subject to the service contract labor standards as a result. And so that means that the lower micro purchase threshold for services wouldn't apply. So as a result, the $10,000 micro purchase threshold is appropriate and the purchase can be made. So you can see in the case studies we had a lot of gray areas, but there's more. There can be other common things like toll passes and electronic toll collection systems. There's also subway tokens and Metro fare cards for non-commuters. This would be when you're buying those types of things for people to attend meetings if they're at the office but need to go across town or something like that. Those are considered cash equivalents and you should secure them. GSA Fleet undercover confidential registration and tags. Sometimes GSA Fleet can accommodate state requirements and they can buy these for their leasing customers, but when they can't, or when processing the transaction at the agency level is to a bigger benefit to the agency, such as you have the registration for 5 years instead of 2, GSA Fleet can ask you to buy those yourself, and you would buy those with the purchase card. And then parking fees and parking passes should be specific to a vehicle, not a person. And like toll passes, agency policy dictates how these are purchased and used and kept secure. Long-term rentals or lease of buildings, of land or buildings is another quasi-gray area. It's kind of similar to our last case study that we talked about there with the permits. The master contract says that contractors shall have a mechanism to further restrict the use of purchase account for the purchase or acquisition of long-term rentals or lease of land or buildings. Long-term is defined as any rental agreement or lease that extends beyond a 12-month period and it's extended for more than a temporary basis, and is intended for more than a temporary basis, excuse me. In the case of long-term rentals or lease of buildings, the purchase account can be used only as a payment mechanism within the account holder's authorized purchase limits and after consideration of agency organization-specific policies. Now, training is one of those things that's been debated over the years, whether it is or isn't subject to the micro purchase threshold for services. And in the Essentials class over the years, we've tried to apply several different methods to this portion of the training that we give to give some guidance to AOPCs, but agency policies vary greatly. So this year we decided to put it in the advanced class and kind of take a step back and look at the governing regulations behind providing employee training at any type of any type, college courses, training courses, webinars, seminars, et cetera, conferences, and go back to the basics with the information you can use to build your local, your agency and local policies. So based on the site you see here on this slide, agencies can make a determination that training, education, and professional development, when authorized on the agency's training authorization form, which is, you know, for a lot of agencies, the SF Form 182, it's not considered a FAR-based transaction. And as such, the micro purchase threshold for services wouldn't apply to those types of transactions. And some agencies like the DoD have even made a determination that as long as the training is authorized on an SF 182, they've capped it at an even higher transaction level of $25,000. So you can see you've got some latitude, and your agency can look at this from a couple different ways, but you don't have to be held to the $2,500. Training can be obtained from different sources, government and non-government, and you can see if it's from non-government on the left-hand side, what the parameters are for that. While some agencies allow the purchase of tailored training up to the micro purchase threshold, others require that tailored training has to be procured by a warranted contracting officer. Sometimes it depends on the subject matter of the training, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it depends on if it has a scope of work or does not. But typically, if you're tailoring training to the government's requirements, you need a statement of work and other quality policy reviews by a cadre of individuals that can review that and make sure it meets certain requirements like continuous learning points, et cetera. And agencies have decided that tailored training should be procured, by the contracting office. But your agency and local policy should govern in any case when you're buying training. We've outlined just a couple of ways that training is bought differently, and it varies by agency. At many agencies, including GSA, the process and use of the card applies differently depending on what you're buying, whether it's individual courses or existing courses or imported courses or subscriptions. So you can see here we've got both buying individual training and existing courses and buying existing non-tailored training. So the first one is if you're buying individual slots. Those would be considered their own transaction even when paid together, and the purchase card can be used up to the single purchase limit in accordance with your agency's guidelines. If you're buying existing training that is not tailored, such as you're going to buy a Myers-Briggs seminar for people, for 35 people in your office, or a 3-day retirement course, the purchase of the entire course and the micro purchase is where the micro purchase threshold applies, and the dollar value of that entire course is what you have to use to determine if you can use your card. And you can see some examples here in the slide. When you're buying training that's tailored, those courses where material and content are tailored specific to the agency, such as learning development leadership development programs, project-specific kickoff training, et cetera, those should be purchased with a formal contract by a warranted contracting officer. Those typically require a statement of work, and that's why. And there's also subscriptions for group training services. If the purchase is a subscription to access on-demand training, the micro purchase threshold applies to the dollar value of the cost of the subscription. Costs are not typically prorated in these cases or adjusted up or down, depending on the number of people who actually access the training as a flat fee. When it comes to reporting on your transactions, if you're an agency that's required to report to the Federal Procurement Database System, or FPDS, as a minimum, you must report all contract actions over the micro purchase threshold awarded under an indefinite delivery contract vehicle, to include calls and orders against existing contracts. Now, the reason I bring this up is because we can use the card to place orders over the micro purchase threshold, and so that's why we talk about this reporting. Now, Center for Charge Card Management reports purchase data to FPDS under the micro purchase threshold. But we've gotten a lot of questions about, hey, if we report on an individual or an indefinite delivery vehicle and we group our orders under and over together, which is allowable to save administrative costs, you can group those together per the FAR, then are we duplicate reporting? And we are not. We addressed that in the Smart Pay Bulletin 26. You see referenced up above the bullets here. And we only report at the agency level. We don't get into numbers of transactions and total dollars and things like that of each transaction, and we don't break it out into contracts or anything. So if you're doing a micro purchase buy, whether it's against an existing contract or it's just on open market, it's going to be reported by us the same regardless. But like I said, agencies have the option to consolidate their reporting if they have some that are over the micro-purchase threshold against vehicles and under. And you can use an FPDS Express report for this. It's outlined in FAR subpart 4.6. And you can do that. They give you all the parameters of how to do that. And not a lot of people are going to have to do this, but we bring it up just because it's an advanced concept under the purchase card. When it does come to COVID-19 purchases, there is a National Interest Action Code P20C that should be used if you're coding those things for the pandemic. Best practices in program management, we're going to go over a few of those here. They're found in the OMB Circular A123 Appendix B. Maximizing the use of reports and bank associations tools. We have a lot of mandatory reports available at the agency organization level, and they're listed in section C731 of the master contract. Things like declined transaction reports, delinquency reports, fraud analytics reports, renewable reports, quarterly merchant analysis reports and merchant ranking reports, transaction dispute reports. There's also ad hoc reports, so if you don't know how to pull those, you can get training from your bank. You can contact your level 1 AOPC for how to schedule that. You can leverage purchase card power using category strategic solutions that permit the charge card as an ordering or payment solution, and looking at your agency-specific requirements and deciding if strategic solutions are good for you or a way to do that, and working with your category managers for those types of vehicles that you would be interested in. Is a way to get that started. And in the notes for this, there's a whole step-by-step process, and they're included in the OMB circular too. So you can look that up if you're interested. Instituting internal management controls, this is just common sense. You can implement stricter internal controls to mitigate risks, such as performing periodic reviews, conducting internal charge card program reviews, monitoring your reports, deactivating cards during periods of non-travel status for travel cards or purchase cards for people who are, let's say, out on, let's say, a leadership program or something like that. You can look at the number of charge accounts and the span of control for approving officials and keep up on new and innovative solutions and tools that we have, such as data analytics and establishing certain controls using case management through the data analytics and fraud management tools that we have under SmartPay 3. You can also initiate administrative or disciplinary actions for card misuse, abuse, and repeated account delinquency. Agencies should have that as part of their charge card policies, and if you don't, you should consider adding it. And then the best thing is learn from others and learn from others' mistakes, right? So we have audit reports and findings on file at the smartpay.gsa.gov website in a repository for that, and we have a lot of purchase card audits out there right now. And this next slide is a rundown of some of the findings or the pattern of findings that existed between those purchase card audits. So some of the things that the audits recommended as a whole were to strengthen systematic oversight and internal controls. This means including looking at your maintaining the account status, internal audits of transactions, files, and logs, identification of split purchases, patterns of potential misuse that you're seeing, and noncompliance with policies. Also looking at categories of high-risk purchases and if disciplinary action has been used when there's been misuse or abuse found. You can also strengthen documentation to support purchases. That's really important. You can never seem to document enough, and if in doubt, you should throw a document into the file, whether it's about proof of a purchase, like a receipt or an invoice, or proof that the supply has been received, like a third-party receipt, etc. You can also educate your approving officials on what to look for in the review of a transaction on the cardholder statement and provide regular training as a refresher. This was a recommendation that was pretty much throughout every audit report, as was educating cardholders about what constitutes an improper purchase and how sales tax should be removed at the time of purchase and to rotate vendors when they're making repetitive purchases. Those all three were the big takeaways from the audit reports on the purchase cards. So again, the best way is to learn from the mistakes of others, right? Using those mistakes to poke holes in your own policies and procedures and training to make sure that you are airtight at your agency is a great way to keep your program running in tip-top shape and sustain any audit scrutiny that you may have going forward. So I know we've thrown a lot of information at you, but I think we've hit all four of these areas here really well, and here's a quick rundown again today. So we hope you feel comfortable with what we've given you. I know this is a lot of topic material, but I would encourage you to download the materials, read through them, absorb them a little bit, use them as you can as a resource, and if you have questions, you can always contact the Center for Charge Card Management after this presentation. You can have questions either now as part of the live chat we're going to go to here in a minute, or you can, after the forum, contact us at the information you see here. I'll also put my email address here. Again, since I'm the purchase card SME, I would be happy to help answer any questions, help you talk through any issues you've had, give you any recommendations or any just experience I have doing this, like I said, for many, many years. So happy to do that for you. Feel free to email me as well. So what we're going to do now is we're going to thank you for attending this session, and I'm going to ask that you please stay on the line because we're going to have a live Q&A following. Thanks a lot.